Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back from this wonderful donut and tea. Now, I would like to request everyone to settle down so that we can begin the next session. And today, in this panel 8 on environment, resource, and strategic future, we have two esteemed speakers, Mr. Neeraj Singh Manhas and Mr. Prabir Kumar Talukdar. And first, I would like to request Mr. Neeraj Singh Manhas to speak on the issue titled Environmental Political Implication of Mining and Resource Extraction on the Tibetan Plateau and Indian Perspective. Before I hand over this mic to Neeraj, I would like to briefly introduce him. He served as a special advisor for South Asia at the Parle Policy Initiative, Republic of Korea, and is a subject matter expert at the Center for Joint Warfare Studies, Ministry of Defense, Government of India. And his research is particularly focused on India-China border issue, transboundary rivers and water security in South Asia, climate security, and defense studies. Mr. Manhas, we are very happy to have you with us. Please, the floor is yours. Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Chair. A very good afternoon to everyone here. I do not have a PPT presentation. Apologies for that. Also, I do not have the maps, so just spare me for that also. I was wondering that I would just focus on the points, exactly the paper which I have already submitted to TPI. I just want to highlight that this is also not a research paper. This is basically a review paper because I come from a background of a IR. And our main focus was to highlight the Indian perspective more, because that's the main idea behind of writing and talking about this critical issue itself. This topic is mainly focusing on the non-traditional security aspect, which is very much linked with Tibet. And as we know that Tibet is a region where most of the natural resources are there. It's full of natural resources like, for example, the critical minerals, as my research topic also talks about. For example, lithium, cobalt, nickel. So all of these, critical minerals becomes very important and very important for the Tibet also and for the downstream countries also, where India, Bangladesh are equally a part of it. Now, with the advent of rare earth elements in 2023, this becomes more important because as we were talking about critical minerals itself, now with the advent of rare earth elements, with the discovery, I think in 2023, a report came where most of these issues related to the rare earth elements were discussing. So in that, the main issue came that because rare earth elements, for example, what we used to study during our school time, the periodical tables, in that also, for example, few of the examples I've mentioned here, rubidium, boron, tantalium. So all of these have some small, connotations like, where we call them like in form of periodic. So these are basically the subgroups of the critical minerals. And now these rarer elements, why they are becoming important? Because they are being very much, used in the industry of weaponry, aircrafts, all the computer chips which are coming. So, having abundance of these rare earth elements become very important. And what now the China is doing in the Tibet comes into the, the power play. How China is going or playing a bigger role in, utilizing these critical minerals, and how these critical minerals itself will play a, negative role to the downstream countries. So, as usual, there are 132 critical minerals which have been cited, as I mentioned the names. But we also need to see that China's greed for Tibet's mineral is now becoming a permanent part of its occupation, because most of their resources are dependent on these occupation. Now, whenever they are trying to extract the minerals from Tibet, they are working on the idea how they can utilize more and more from these critical minerals. Now, for example, the core argument here also of my paper, which also talks about that how these critical minerals will also be a threatened in the coming time, because the growing need will also going to increase day by day. It's not going to get decrease. So what are the strategies of India, how they can also play a very vital role, because every country needs to securitize their critical minerals. For example, in India also, recently in January 2025, India launched a national critical minerals mission with a cost of 16,300 crores. So over a period of time, the plan is to how they can also extract the minerals, but also to refine it, also to implement it properly. Because the only problem what India is facing right now, we know that we have a lot of abundance of critical minerals, but we do not have a technology to extract it. For example, I'll give you an example. I come from a state of Jammu. And in Jammu, there is a district called Riyasi where Katra Vaishno Devi is there. So there was a lithium mine which was found. And there was a suddenly, because as it is now been connected with the geopolitical issue. So the moment this news came into the highlight, United States came into the picture. They said, we want to help India to extract these mineral resources. Why lithium? Because now we know all the global supply chain with the lithium coming into the picture. E-vehicles, which through which we try to produce the batteries, they becomes very important. And lithium is the core main element through which the batteries would be made. Because now why these countries are focusing more on that, and why China is also doing that? Because China has also pledged that by 2060 they want to be a carbon neutral free country. Similarly, in 2070, India also planned to have a carbon neutral free country. So what is the way out? So the way out is through that how they can also utilize more and more the renewable source of energies. So now one point which is very much connected to these critical minerals is the hydropower. Because the hydropower, wind and solar energies, they are important, but the most important part is the hydropower. Because it doesn't need any kind of a weather predictability. With the wind, we need dependability on the wind, but on the solar, we need a dependability of sun. But with the hydropower, there is nothing like that. There is no dependability. It just now the Tibet, the Yarlang Sampo, which originates from Tibet, we have seen the series of cascades of dam which have been constructed on Yarlang Sampo. Just to go back in the 13th five-year plan itself, where China tried to construct a series of dams, where at that point of a time they highlighted and focused more on the upper and the middle reaches of Yarlang Sampo. But now with the 14th five-year plan, which started in 2021, and it's just about to end over in 2025 itself. So in that, most of the studies have found that, because now my core idea was, I wanted to check that how critical mineral issues are also connected with the water issues. So, there are several reports which have come in 2017, 2020, and 2023. The rivers which is coming from the upper riparian have got black in color. So why? Because the river has found the toxins inside it. The arsenic level of the arsenic content in the water has been increased. So, and as it is, it's not fit for the drinking purposes. So the river, which is, which is basically a source of fresh water availability for the people downstream, now becoming unfit for the human consumption. So now the main point is, whatever the mining which is taking place on the upper region of Tibet, how it is going to impact the lower riparian. So now within the India also, in the northeast, and within the Tibet also, all the indigenous people have started coming out, and they have started protesting. And since 2010, most of the people, they have self-immolated themselves. They have tried to raise their voice, but since this was totally under the control of China's PLA, most of the actions were not taken and people were not heard of. Similarly, in India also, whenever the dam construction came into a picture, specifically in the upper region of Siang, which is still under construction, and this is just for the development purposes, and it will provide the state electricity, and it would connect the state electricity to the national grid. But still, people have concern because during the Yangtze Dam, when the Three Gorges Dam was constructed, at that point of time also it has displaced people. Millions of people got displaced. So that itself, becomes a very bigger picture for the future studies, that no matter we are doing a lot of developments through critical minerals, we want to depend ourselves more on renewable sources. But what is the way out? Are we doing it on the cost of environmental degradation? Or what is the future outcome? We all know that everyone wants to talk about clean energy, they want to talk about the green transition, but are we doing it on the cost of environmental degradation? Are we cutting the trees? How indigenous people are also getting affected, we need to ask this question to ourselves. So I think this is largely the paper the paper I have written talks about more on terms of the China's role in it, how they have extracted, what are the implications India will get in the coming time. So that's where I think I would like to end my presentation. Thank you.
Presentation on how the environmental degradation in Tibet has with the strategic dynamic of South Asia, especially India. And thank you for teaching that ahead in time. And now I would like to request Mr. Prabir Talukdar. Mr. Prabir Talukdar is a researcher with a Master in East Asian Studies from Department of East Asian Studies, University of Delhi. And his research is mainly focused on Chinese philosophy, art history, and comparative studies of Chinese and Indian cultural tradition, society, religion, and life practice. And today he'll be talking about from Mandala to modern state, shift in the conceptual geography of Tibet and its political consequences.
Tashiq Dalak to everyone, respected chair and dignitaries. I feel absolutely privileged to be here at Dharamshala and getting a chance to learn and speak as well. I'm absorbing everything that has been discussed and also that my brain can take upon. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge a figure that is very close to my heart who just recently passed away. He's an Assamese icon. His name was Zubin Garg. He was a rebel in his own way. He challenged norms, spoke truth to power, and became a voice for Assam. In a way, that spirit of resistance, that insistence on preserving identity, reminds us of Tibet's struggle to maintain its cultural and political autonomy in the face of overwhelming odds. So, long live the force. So today I'll discuss the transformation of Tibet's political geography, focusing on how a mandala-based system of governance shifted to the logic of the modern state under Chinese rule. I come from Chinese studies, and this is probably would be my first venture into Tibetan history and Tibetan politics, so please cut me some slack. Uh, this study also explores how Tibetans have contested and adapted to these changes in both historical and contemporary context. Before we move on to my research question, we first need to understand this figure with Buddha sitting at the core and concentric circles around him. This is what we call mandala, which originates in Buddhist ritual practice as well as an art form. So in spiritual practice, one would move from the periphery towards the core. And as one would move to the center, we call it a spiritual progression. That means you are close to the enlightenment. However, if you reverse it, this becomes a political mandala, which means power at the center, and it becomes weaker as it moves towards the periphery. Upon researching, I found out that political anthropologists Stanley Tambia and Rosita Delios have applied this idea of political mandala to Southeast Asian kingdoms. Stanley started first, and he applied to the Southeast Asian, where he called this a galactic polities. It resembles like a universe, a galaxy, where the power is at the core, and there are pockets of the power all around the concentric circles. Rosita went a bit further and applied the same concept to Chinese philosophy, where the king, the Wang, is actually at the center. He is the one who connects people with the divine order, and you have the tributary system running around him. So now when we overlap this theory into Tibetan history, we see some striking similarity. Pre-modern Tibet's political structure was organized around Lhasa and other monastic centers as loci of authority, and sovereignty over peripheral regions was often negotiated rather than defined by surveyed borders. So it's important here to mention that in the morning I have a discussion with another scholar that Geoffrey Samuels and Tony Huber have already emphasized the deep entanglement of, if I may say so, representing mandala with conceptual geography of Tibet. But how it differentiates with my research is this, because I want to understand how the structure of mandala governance was spatially reimagined when Tibet actually encountered a modern territorial state, that is China. So mandala here is therefore not a Southeast Asian framework, but rather a trans-Buddhist spatial imagination, and one that helps us to understand Tibet's governance better. Now, coming to the research questions, I want to know how this theory fits into this. So what happens when a fluid, sacred, and center-oriented conception of space is replaced by a system built on fixed borders, centralized administration, and state surveillance? I have broken this question into three parts to understand it layer by layer. First, how did pre-modern Tibetan governance operate through a mandala-like spatial and political order? What changes occurred when the PRC imposed modern state logic on Tibetan space and authority after 1950? How do Tibetan exile communities and local resistance challenge the imposition of state-defined sovereignty? These questions frame both the historical analysis and the contemporary implications. For a methodology and framework, I employed a combination of different methodologies. Reinhard Koselleck's conceptual history allows us to trace shift in key political terms such as sovereignty, center, and frontier over time. Secondly, through understanding critical political geography, including Henry Lefebvre's theory of the social production of space, and Winnie Chakul's analysis of territorial mapping, helps us to analyze how spatial control is produced and enforced, particularly through infrastructure, surveillance, and mapping. Finally, Tibetan intellectual and historical sources provide insight into the ontological clash between traditional mandala governance and modern state structure. Pre-modern Tibet didn't operate like a modern state with fixed borders. Instead, authority was organized around sacred centers, monasteries, and pilgrimage routes. Samtem Karme and Shering Shakya have emphasized how pre-1950 Tibet was governed through fluid centers of power tied to religious institutions. Power radiated from spiritual leaders, creating a polycentric system. The mandala framework provided a cosmological and practical lens which legitimacy can be understood. Authority was inseparable from religious and metaphysical principles. The authority of Lhasa extended across a very humongous region, but it was often negotiated with local rulers and monastic elites. Boundaries were never surveyed or fixed. Instead, sovereignty operated through a network of allegiance, patronage, and tribute. It's important to note here that Samdem Karme points out that Tibetan historical sources rarely ever used a word called border in modern sense. Instead, we have evidence of texts that point out territorial demarcation in terms of natural features like mountains and rivers. So geography was sacred and mutable rather than abstract and mapped. Scholars like Dawa Nodbu have described how Tibetan governance is a synthesis of political realism and spiritual cosmology. Space as socially produced. So what do we mean by that? Henry Lefebvre's concept explained that cosmological ideas are not and cannot be separated from material things. Again, what we mean by that is that something how we imagine cosmos and divine order that is tied to our societies and what kind of spaces we inhabit. For an example, ancient cities, temples, monasteries are designed like cosmos, like mandala. That is a material reflection of a cosmological idea. Space is neither a thing nor a container. Tibetan space was actively produced through ritual practice, trade networks, and pilgrimage circuits. Monasteries functioned as centers of religious, economic, and administrative authority, and sacred geography was experienced through daily life. Shering Wangyal Shava's work on Tibetan cartography at Princeton highlights how Tibetan spatial knowledge was experiential, ritualistic, and non-linear. Professor Lokesh Chandra has also drawn a connection of Buddhist cosmology and mandala's role in shaping the imagination across Asia. Now comes the PRC, the transition to modern state logic. So what is a modern state? Well, according to Benedict Anderson and Thongchai Winichakul, the modern state can be defined as something like a brutal consolidation of power shaped by modern cartography and bureaucracy. And the most important thing is homogenized national imagination. The entry of the PRC after 1950 replaced Tibet's fluid spatial order with centralized bureaucracy, fixed borders, and systematic surveillance. The 17-point agreement promised autonomy but paved the way for the dismantling of this theocratic governance. Monasteries were not just religious centers, but also economic hubs. By the 17th century, monasteries like Drepung, Sera, and Tashi Lunpo commanded significant states and managed huge local population. So this created a polycentric order where different regions recognized the spiritual authority of Dalai Lama, but also retained considerable autonomy. Even within central Tibet, aristocratic families maintained influence independent of Lhasa's direct control. But the entry of PRC's land reforms and secularization stripped monasteries of their economic and political power, effectively dissolving and dismantling the mandala-like polycentric governance. In the territorial reorganization and infrastructure, the PRC further consolidated control through mapping, infrastructure, and surveillance. With the 17-point agreement in 1951, the framework positioned Tibet not as a sacred mandala, but as a territory to be re-engineered and mobilized to fit into the definition of a modern state. Thongchai Winichakul's concept of geobody is crucial here. Kingdoms and empires never had fixed edges. People thought of boundaries in terms of cultural and spiritual terms. But with modern mapping, states began to draw sharp lines on paper. This forced people to imagine nation as a clearly bounded body that could be seen, measured, and probably defended. This is what he meant by geobody, a territorial self-image that a nation comes to believe is natural and sacred, even though it's a modern construction. strategic roads and railways like the Qinghai-Tibet line connected Lhasa to surrounding regions, serving both military and economic objectives like increased Han migration and resource extraction. At the same time, a dense network of police stations, CCTV, and digital monitoring created a panoptic system that integrated Tibetan space into governable territory defined by state logic. I believe the strategic roads and building railway lines, I believe, is an intelligent way of chaining Tibet into PRC, something that only will get stronger with time and hard to shackle off. Sharing Sakya very beautifully puts it in a way that explains why PRC's idea of liberation of Tibet is epistemological. What we mean by that is China is not only asserting control here, it is also imposing a particular way of knowing Tibet. That is, that Tibet is a feudal, backward, poor, and in need of severe modernization, and which would definitely and naturally legitimize PRC's control over Tibet. Monastic institutions lost autonomy, become administrative outposts with state-appointed management committees. Over 1 million Tibetan children as young as 4 are enrolled in state-run boarding schools that prioritize Mandarin instruction and nationalist ideology, displacing Tibetan knowledge and cultural practices. So just like we had surgical strikes, these are surgical assimilation designed in a way to graft a Han-centered worldview into Tibetan youth. Together, these measures disrupted the traditional social, educational, and the very religious fabric of Tibetan society. Identity and cultural contestation, Tibetans in exile have preserved cultural, religious, and educational traditions outside China. Debates over the Dalai Lama's succession illustrate the ongoing contestation of spiritual authority. And the 14th Dalai Lama himself is a living intellectual source, and he very brilliantly articulated through his lectures how Tibet's cosmological governance adapts to exile conditions. Within Tibet, covered rituals, protests, and self-immolations reveal persistent forms of resistance, highlighting that the struggle over space and authority is both material and epistemic. Epistemic and political implications. This case illustrates that modern states do more than manage territory. They actively produce it. Tibet's transformation shows that the shift from mandala governance to state logic is an epistemic one, with the very meaning of space, authority, and identity is redefined. Alternative spatial imaginaries endure, demonstrating that modern state models are not universally accepted or even uncontested. Key Tibetan political concepts such as mandala and, please forgive my pronunciation, is Cho Chik Sung Dwell, reveal that authority was relational, negotiated, and deeply intertwined with religious legitimacy. Modern statehood is not a neutral or inevitable endpoint, but an imposed framework. Conceptual history helps us to see that political ideas actively shape social realities and resistance rather than merely describing them. At the end, in conclusion, Tibet's spatial imagination are not simply artifacts of the past, but part of a living and breathing intellectual tradition. Tibet's political transformation represents a collision between cosmologically informed governance and rationalized structures of the modern state. Despite repression, Tibetan intellectual traditions and spatial imaginaries continue to challenge dominant state narratives. By studying Tibet's history, we gain insight into sovereignty, governance, and cultural resilience, offering lessons for decolonial geopolitics and alternative framework of political legitimacy. Thank you so much.
For this deeply reflective presentation on the conceptual and political relation of Tibetan special honor, which was from Matilda Baby of God, which is border crossing or border issues of the Chinese population. And now with the both presentation complete, we now open the floor for question and discussion. And please keep your questions